Driving on highways can be tedious, especially on long-haul drives. However, for some truck drivers, the journey took a weird turn after encountering something that could not be explained. The following two stories go beyond the usual challenges of the road, throwing drivers into encounters with the unexplained, where a seemingly ordinary road transforms into a space where the supernatural and the unexplained exist side by side, leaving a lasting impact on the drivers. The Old Woman. The first story is told by a trucker whose regular run was between Vancouver and San Francisco. Normally the drive was easy, with few challenges, and the trucker preferred driving at night simply because there was much less traffic to deal with. The trucker claimed to have seen many unusual things, such as strange lights in the sky, or people walking along the shoulder of the road in the middle of nowhere and far from civilization. On one of his first runs, he saw a lady in a blue summer dress casually walking down the side of the freeway, lit up by the full moon. The trucker was on a stretch of road that was miles away from anything in either direction, and he was the first vehicle on the road that she'd likely seen since dusk. The woman didn't bother to look up to acknowledge him, and just kept on walking with a vacant smile on her face. He figured she may have been a hippie on the Oregon Trail, staying on a nearby campsite, so he kept on driving. If that was not the case, she was a vulnerable figure in the middle of nowhere. But she was just the beginning. There were many more to come. What always struck him as strange was that for some reason, you never saw them during the day, or maybe they just didn't stand out as much in the daylight amongst the traffic. Even so, they did tend to stand out more when you're driving far from civilization in the dark. Other truckers have a name for these people and called them moon wanderers, but he preferred to call them shoulder walkers because that was where they always were. They came in different shapes and sizes as well, for men, women, people you'd see anywhere, but on some occasions they did look creepy. But one night, a few months ago, it went to a whole new creepy level. He drove past what looked to be an old lady. She was wearing a hospital gown and looked like someone on death row. She had sunken eyes that looked like they'd just given up on life. The hair was white and frizzy and her skin was deathly pale. But her mouth told a different story, and she was smiling as if her grandchildren had just called her name. She was walking with a slow shuffle as the hospital slippers walked along the gravelly road. The trucker wanted to keep driving because her strange appearance was giving him the willies. But then again, she was somebody's grandmother. So he drove his truck to the side of the road and took a flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of the cab. He could hear the sound of her shuffling along the road as he'd stopped his truck just ahead of her. He then quickly checked the Maps app on his phone and saw that the closest town to where they were was over 50 miles away. There was no way that the old lady was able to walk that distance. He then held up the flashlight and started walking towards the sound of her shuffling feet. He called out, "Hello, ma'am," hoping she would respond, but she kept shuffling along the gravelly road. As she slowly appeared through the flashlight, the hairs on the back of his neck started to rise up. He almost cried out as her ghostly appearance came into view. Not because anything was different from before, but because she looked so much more sickly as she grew closer. He said, "Ma'am, are you okay? You're in the middle of nowhere." But she didn't say a word and kept on smiling and moved steadily forward. His heart was now beating hard. As he studied her face, he thought to himself, "She's just senile and needs my help." At the same time, his feet were frozen in place. All the time, the old woman was getting closer, and as she got within 10 feet of him, her wrinkled hands began to reach slowly up. Her fingers wheeled in his direction, like a grandma reaching for a grandchild. She opened her mouth, but didn't say anything. She just grinned at him with pale gums. At this stage, his legs just gave out, and as he fell onto his side, she reached down to help him with surprising speed and dexterity. Then before he knew what was happening, she had her bony fingers around his ankles, and he was being dragged down the road. Where the hell was she getting her strength from? He desperately pulled back, but her grip was superhuman, and the addition of his weight didn't seem to slow down her walking in the slightest. If things were not frightening enough, she then stared down at him with her beady sunken eyes, and her mouth was stretched open in a smile. In a state of panic, he kicked at her with all the fight he had in him and struck her on the jaw. To his utmost horror, it was like kicking solid concrete, but fortunately she let go of him with no signs of being injured. He crawled backwards towards the middle of the road, and she kept walking down the shoulder towards him. At this stage her hands had fallen back down to her side, and her mouth was now closed into a tight-lipped smile, but her gaze stayed locked on him as she slowly shuffled out of the beam of the flashlight and away from him. He waited as the sound of her shuffling feet began to slowly fade, and he just sat there for around half an hour in stunned silence. He eventually worked up the nerve to go back to his truck. Once inside, he looked around, but there was no sign of the lady. But as he drove down the highway, it didn't take long to catch up with her. Her eyes were still fixed on him as he continued to walk along the road. The last he saw of her as he drove away was her thin, smirking lips. According to some of the other drivers, he was the first to try and interact with the shoulder walker, and hopefully the last. Since that moment, he continued to see people strolling down the highway in the pitch dark, and on one occasion he even saw a child. But there was no way he was ever going to stop for them again, old women or child. Strangely though, since that night, the shoulder walkers always looked right at him as he drove past, which they never used to do. It was like the moment the old woman saw him, they all did. He now wants this to be a warning to the public, as you may not be so lucky. The thunderstorm. This second story came from a truckie one night when he was driving through Kansas 170. Whilst driving, he was hit by the most severe thunderstorm he'd ever encountered. It was so bad that the road started to flood and he had to pull into a service plaza until the extreme weather subsided. But then things got really creepy as he was watching the storm. He saw a series of lightning strikes followed by a blackout. Then an enormous bright light started moving behind the clouds. It was too slow to be an aircraft, yet too fast to be part of the storm system. The light then moved up over the hills and trees before crossing directly overhead, before disappearing behind the service plaza. The whole event took between 5 to 10 minutes. Suddenly, everything in the sky took on an eerie blue glow and lit up the parking lot. He seriously believed aliens were invading. Within 10 minutes of the strange light disappearing, the rain completely stopped and all the lights came back on. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Totally spooked, he quickly departed the plaza, whilst at the same time looking in the mirror for spaceships or those machines from War of the Worlds.